Okay, so I just want to briefly go over some of the logistics, and we had these chapters to read for your past week and this week too, but thinking about sort of the exact terminology is really important to consider, especially when approaching poetry. So, first and foremost, chapter 21 gets you into a lot of the other sort of basics. That's why I kind of had you skip ahead a little bit, just so you know exactly in terms of like structure and, looking at a poem from a critical lens, what you're sort of dealing with. And I think how it really lays it out really well in the book because he talks in great detail to give you a good sense of a great number of these, really, really important aspects to consider when reading poetry. So he also starts us off in talking about in traditional metrical poetry, poetry in fixed forms. The question of where one ends the line does not arise. You can usually tell that. But sometimes a poet only counts accents per line rather than accents and syllables. That's accentual verse for what you can see sort of right here from Philip Levine's poem. Everybody's had this room one time or another and never thought to sweep. And often outside the snow stiffens, the roofs loosen their last teeth into the street. So you can find formal structure by the number of syllables in each line. You can see more examples of, one of my favorite examples here is Metaphors by Sylvia Plath. It's actually a riddle poem. And I'm not gonna reveal it to you right now, so I don't ruin it for you if you haven't figured it out or read it yet. But when you go through and you read this, the whole poem itself is trying to tell you something. So it doesn't matter if it's unrhymed verse or unmetrical. The idea, especially, is that there's no sometimes pattern that you're looking for. Some poets have different preferences on how short, how long, how different their line should be. So good reasons for breaking up a verse line at a certain place. One, it's often logical to stop it at the end of a sentence or phrase. And you have an example, logic meaning it just helps you understand better what the poem is about. So this poem above is divided into 7 stanzas, one for each sentence. So that's important to kind of look at where you have that like natural pause. But then if you look in the following poem, how each line ends, there would be a natural pause in speaking it. So that's also something to consider. Another reason is often lines are broken up for pacing or a sense of an unbroken flow. That's also one thing to think about. One works against the principle of ending at the end of a natural phrase unit and sort of enjabs the line, and instead you end in the middle of a phrase. And this makes the reader ignore the line end or pause slightly where, if you're reading a traditional prose sentence, you probably wouldn't. So that's something to think about. In rhyme poetry, sometimes it helps to mute the rhymes, and this way you're calling less attention to the word that's in rhyme. It doesn't seem as sing-songy. It doesn't, sort of stand out as much. And we have examples of that too. More so, you might want to break up the line and give emphasis to a certain word or phrase, and then you put that word or phrase at the end of the line. And that's what really makes us like pay attention to it. So here in this poem that you're looking at, tugging in the following stanza, darker now, I put out the wet laundry. In the wind the pulley creaks and shifts. My dresses lift tugging at the pins. I go in to where my daughter sleeps. And that's from Night Feeding. So you can hear where sort of the tension and sort of the emphasis kind of lies. There are also times when a line break can play the part of punctuation and it clarifies syntax and meaning. So examples of that, sometimes line breaks are really useful with poems that don't have a lot of punctuation or sometimes no punctuation at all until the very, very ending of a poem. And sometimes you have a poem that's kind of tight and minimalist, meaning that it's shorter, it doesn't have a lot to it, and so that thought has more compression and emotion that kind of go with it. So you can look at some of these examples here. Kiki Diaz spits just like I used to spit back when growing up 30 years ago in Memphis on Prescott Street. So, almost that sort of breathless feel that kind of comes in with the poem. And then largely, a large spirited poem with an embracing vision might require a lot longer lines, inclusive lines to it. So if you're going back and looking at some traditional forms of American poetry, this is a passage here from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. And so you want to notice, as Carl mentions, the lyricism he looks at with the long line. So each line goes here and here to make up the stanzas. Sometimes you want to break your line for the surprise or the irony, so that kind of emphasis sort of comes in. Especially if you're trying to create emphasis or sort of emotion from a previous line. It's almost like it carries on to the next one. So here, in the other room, I danced to the radio with Annie's kids while she carried on business in her bedroom. She paid me those afternoons by the hour to keep her children happy and out of the way. So here you have the lines going on even into the next stanzas here as well. A couple other reasons that Howitt gives: poems are often concerned with the actual visual shape of their poem, and this is a really cool part of poetry. Here you can see the example of a certain visual design. So certainly that plays a big role in how lines are structured and set up. And what we're working on for this week is looking at anaphoric verse. It's one of your poetry exercises. And here that constant repetition in each line goes back in November. And here it runs for as many as 8 actual lines on the page too. A couple other reasons: line breaks are sometimes guided by a poet's intuitive sense. A poet might just feel like there has to be a line break. It has to go to something else. It's not, uncommon that happens. It's sort of a feeling. Sometimes the poet's trying to break a line to mask a rhyme because they don't want the rhyme words to find and sort of end up at the last line, and they don't want that pattern there. Sometimes there's special reason for certain spacing and line breaks. This poem that Carl included here by Paul Bachman, it attempts to be a transcription of the author's phone conversation with one of his mentors, the writer William Cullis Williams. So in this, you can see and learn about that actually Williams had a number of different strokes, and he had a hard time speaking in his last few years of his life, and that's how it's reflected in the poem here. It's a very cool kind of conception to come up with. A lot of modern poets, are using way more different types of improvisation and typography and different types of ways of expressing themselves in poetry. A lot of sometimes unconventional with mixing of a little traditional patterns. So here, a few lines are written what we call tercets, which are 3-line stanzas. What interests me is what turns over at the boiling point, peeling mass from light. So, and they have this progressively, you can see, indented margin to them, which is interesting. And the last reason that Howitt gives is there's times when the line breaks of a poem are sort of important to how the poem works. This is a poem by Terry Hertzler where you can see the structure. It's very cool. A is for America. It's the funny things we do for love. B is for bombs. C is for Charlie. D is for dead. E is for E1, E2, E3, and all of these together tell a story within the poem. So that's a really interesting, different, really fun kind of way to structure your lines. Now, we'll definitely be working with line breaks and structure, but I want you to have a good sense. I'm not saying you need to memorize all these different things, but certainly you want to familiarize yourself with the beginnings of the terminology for poetry. I've also included on your Canvas page just the most common literary terms that you're going to come up with. A great deal of these are in your books, but just so you know, because we're going to draw on many of them to write your own pieces of poetry and to keep reading. We've heard some of these basic ones already, but you want to very much familiarize yourself. Some of these I'm absolutely guessing you've heard of in past classes and other different types of writing. So I want you to make sure that you can go through and have a good sense. These are probably the most common literary terms that are associated with poetry, ones that certainly we'll be using. Some are very self-explanatory, like we've been talking about stanzas. That's the division of poetry named for the number of lines it contains. We've talked about similes and metaphors. That's something that translates from other literature classes. But we've also begun talking a great deal about imagery. We talk about verse versus a metric line of poetry, and all of these different examples and sort of classifications of verse come in with that too. We've talked about rhyme, but rhyme has a difference from rhythm and so forth. So one thing you definitely want to do is keep this handy, keep it near you, because we're going to try to incorporate some of these literary terms into the varying exercises and our prompts that we're going to be looking at as well. So I would say, if anything, just to sort of skim the surface, this is a great place to kind of keep as your little literary term cheat sheet for different poetry terms. But I think that should cover a great deal of the notes this week. While it might look like a lot of reading and writing, a lot of it is just going to sort of naturally flow into learning the process of really feeling comfortable openly writing about poetry and reading poetry too, because I know poetry can be some of the most intimidating types of literature, but we want to really break that stigma and feel comfortable approaching it as a good reader.